Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name's Jeff Morgan. I'm a managing director at Deloitte. I also sit within a group at Deloitte called Converge Health. And over the last 6 years or so, Converge Health has been building out platforms and solutions to help our clients better leverage healthcare data and also engage patients and healthcare ecosystem in new ways. I'm joined here on stage with John Kai, who's an executive director from Merck in their real-world data analytics and innovation group. Vikas Patel, another executive director for MRL IT engineering, and my colleague Raveen Sharma, who's a specialist leader at Deloitte and also sits within Converge Health. So today we're going to talk about how we partnered with Merck to build out a cloud-based data and analytics platform that's called the Real World Data Exchange that's being used to advance drug development and commercialization. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what real-world data is, you could think about it as it's patient data that's either generated or collected outside of a randomized clinical trial setting. It's essentially the exhaust from the healthcare ecosystem. So it's traditionally comes from things like administrative claims sources from health plans or electronic health records from payers or from providers. Recently, we've seen new sources emerge, such as data coming from wearable devices, sensors, and even social media. And even imaging data is becoming more readily available for secondary use. So the unique thing about these data is it provides a unique view into the patient's journey through their disease and their treatments outside of the confines of a clinical trial setting. So why is that important? If you take the example of oncology, there's roughly 3% of adult oncology patients actually enter into clinical trials. So that means we have 97% of the population who have cancer that we don't truly understand. So real-world data could help us fill that gap. Patients that are in clinical trials tend to be much younger and have less comorbidities than patients out in the real world. So what real-world data allows us to do is answer questions around, does that 97%, do they respond the same as the patients in the trials? Are there subgroups that might be super responders or might not respond at all? Or are there adverse events that we didn't observe in a clinical trial, but we're now seeing signals of that in the real world setting? Or how long are patients staying on these drugs outside of the controls of a clinical trial setting? So these are some of the questions a lot of our pharmaceutical companies are trying to answer with real world data. And that kind of really underscores the need for and the increased focus of real-world data capabilities to the pharmaceutical industry. It has the ability to impact decisions across the entire product life cycle. When you look at R&D, for instance, the cost to bring a drug to market continues to grow, and R&D productivity continues to decline. So real-world data, there's an opportunity to use it to do trials in new ways to help bend that cost curve and get drugs to market faster. And once those drugs are on market, stakeholders from across healthcare, whether they're providers or health plans, are demanding more evidence about these products in a real-world setting. And these data can help generate that evidence to demonstrate the value it's providing to broader populations. And some of these medicines that are coming to market, providing appropriate access to it is becoming more difficult. So real-world data is going to start to underpin new value-based reimbursement models, where you'll see a shift from where you could reimburse based on the value the drug is delivering to the patient, as opposed to the volume of interventions we're delivering to patients. So, all this really kind of is driving increased investment into this space. And one of the big places we're seeing these types of investments is the underlying technology these pharmaceutical companies need to both manage and analyze these data. So, my first question is for John. So Merck is, for the longest time has been known as a leader in the space of real-world data and evidence. And, maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges that your organization was facing and why you decided that you needed to build the real-world data exchange.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I think you gave a really great introduction, why we need real-world data to generate real-world evidence as a pharma company. So it starts with a business. It doesn't start with technology. We're not a technology company. So first of all, as a company, we're not small. So we're purchasing real-world data. We're getting real-world data from healthcare partnerships. But we need to know what data assets we're purchasing. and what function are getting this data, what function getting other data, so that we can have a clear line of sight, not duplicating that effort. And it turns out we don't have that clear transparency even before we develop this platform. And the second thing is, not many people know how to use that data. Maybe a few small group like data scientists know that. So once we purchase that data, a lot of questions being asked, within research or from our commercial organizations. But to get to the answer takes so much time. That's not efficient, right? And last, even though data scientists can use the data, we don't have good traceability or transparency how they use the data. Because we're working in a regulatory environment. We need to know what they did with the data. And regulatory agencies need to know how we come up with real-world evidence. So that traceability, that compliance need to be in place. And old technology didn't help with that. That's why we need a new platform to make sure we have good data visibility, availability, ease of use, good access, but also compliance, validation, and real-time analytics to support decision-making.
Yep. Thanks, John. And so, Raveen, I know you're a big part in the delivery of the program. So if you could talk a little bit about the goals of the initial releases of the platform and kind of what we were trying to accomplish.
Yeah, sure, Jeff. And leveraging off of what John said in terms of the challenges. So really, the goals of the initial releases, the initial MVP, if you will, of this RWDEX platform, which stands for Real World Data Exchange, was really to provide transparency. So really an enterprise view into what data assets, what data is licensed and purchased by Merck, and also what analytics are done off of that data. And Merck being a large global enterprise, large global organization, silos existed. Silos existed geographically, silos existed by function. So things were repeated. Purchase of data was repeated. There's duplicate data bought. The approach to doing certain types of analyses were repeated. So that was wasteful, time-consuming, inefficient. So there needed to be transparency into this data and analytics process. The next thing we needed to provide was a modern, scalable, open, modular, cloud-based platform. And really what was needed was to radically improve or radically change the experience that the data scientists, who were the core users at the time, had with the data. So performance needed to be improved radically. Accessibility and provisioning of the data sets needed to be made more efficient and faster. So that was the purpose of the infrastructure. Along with that as well is the fact that we wanted to introduce a whole new kind of user to being able to gain or glean or benefit from the insights from real-world data. So as John mentioned, it's been in the expert remit or expert domain for a long, long time. So we wanted to enable this platform or use this platform as a springboard to provide self-service analytics in a very governed, carefully deployed manner to a larger group of users within Merck. And then lastly, governance is very important. And this is data governance as well as governance of access to certain types of analyses and access to certain types of tools on the platform, because we're trying to encourage this as an enterprise asset or an enterprise resource. So we want to attract a large group of diverse users. And with that new kind of wave of use of real-world data, as John mentioned, it's a regulated environment. You want to be careful as to who is able to look at what, because there's different levels of sophistication and domain expertise of these users. So governance and defining and designing and implementing a governance structure was very key to this platform. So, I mentioned the word MVP, so minimum viable product. So we're able to essentially address a lot of these key tenets, these three key tenets, in 2 releases spread over 6 months using an agile methodology. And the reason we were able to move so quickly is, one, we partnered very, very carefully, very, very well with all of the groups at Merck. And secondly, we brought consulting accelerators and also productized modules to this environment to rapidly assemble this environment. So that's how we were able to address some of these issues in a very rapid time frame.
Great. Thanks, Raveen. And John, from like an end user's perspective, like, can you kind of expand on some of the capabilities that have been delivered to the organization so far?
Yes, it's good that we have some internal capabilities now, right? First, in terms of knowledge management, we know what data assets are available in-house and what potential data assets we can purchase without duplication or too much redundancies. And also, we know what studies we have done using that data. That reduces redundancy as well. And second piece is self-service tools. This is important to us, right? Not only a few who can analyze data, but the majority just wait for that insight to be generated. That takes a long time. So we actually roll out a new role called citizen data scientist, who get trained and are now able to use a set of self-service analytic tools to generate insight more at a real time so that they can make timely and informed decisions. And last, we still want to keep our data scientists to work on this platform using advanced analytic tools to answer complex questions and programming within R, SAS, Python, whatever language they like, and solve the complex biological or clinical questions.
Thanks, John. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the problems that were addressed with the real-world data exchange and kind of the value or the functionality that's been delivered. So maybe we could transition into kind of how it was implemented. So I know, Vikas, you were heavily involved with kind of leading the design of the architecture and some key principles that had to be instilled in delivering this. So if you could kind of talk a little bit about some of those.
Sure. I think so. One of the things, what John mentioned, like the use cases that John mentioned that we were looking at when we were trying to solve the problem. When we started to look at solution space around this, like internally built solutions, external solutions, we quickly realized there is no single one solution that will sort of fit the mold, right? And the idea there, to Raveen's earlier point, is to sort of how do you build a platform ecosystem, right? Where you can sort of generate more solutions because there are more solutions that will be needed in the future. So sort of how would you design proof it for the future? So I think the principles that we used, key principles, was mainly a componentized architecture, an extensible architecture, and a scalable architecture. And I think if you look at that, so a componentized architecture, we had a data platform and a solutions piece, sort of as a 2 separate main big components, and connected through APIs and a layer of APIs and microservices. On the extensibility end, we kept it enough at a place where you could sort of extend existing solutions, build on top of it, et cetera. And I think when you started to evaluate tools, AWS brings a lot of data platform to build. And I think, as Raveen mentioned, the converged health solutions really provided us a good accelerator to start implementing at scale very fast. So that's sort of the key pieces that we use there.
Yeah, okay. And so, Raveen, I know you were leading the implementation parts of this, so maybe you could walk us kind of through how you took those key principles into development.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Vikas and Jeff. So the first step in the process is actually not on this page. The first step is licensing, paying for, purchasing, acquiring the data that you want to then further analyze, right? And one of the things we're exploring and intending to use is the recently launched innovative AWS data exchange. And there's been launches and earlier discussions today, earlier presentations on that. So that's something we are looking at to essentially make that first step of data acquisition more seamless, frictionless, more efficient. So coming onto the page. So, the first thing that really happens is real-world data, which is purchased, licensed, subscription data for the most part, makes its way into an intake bucket, into S3, where we start processing it. And so what's been established is this data ingestion framework, which is triggered by a Lambda function, obviously, and then really uses PySpark on an EMR cluster to essentially ingest the data, where we do a whole barrage of data quality checks. And just to give you a sense, these are data sets. We call them by the simple term data sets. Some of the more complex or larger ones, they have dozens of tables. They have hundreds of columns. They cover anywhere from 30 to 50 million patients. And when you put that in a normalized or semi-normalized structure, you could be approaching 500 million rows of data. So all of that is processed through this ingestion framework. And that's just one of many data sets. That then gets ingested into a Redshift database. And that is made available for downstream analytics. And just to give you a little more context as well there, we have a 20-node cluster. It's a dense compute cluster. And we're looking at about 40 terabytes of data at the moment. And it's growing at about 4 to 6 terabytes per month. That's kind of what we're looking at. So that's the ingestion process. And every step of the process, we use a Glue framework really to extract technical metadata. So we know exactly what's happening every step of the way as we go through this ingestion process. And that's again important because that is required to meet the requirements of the regulatory demands that John alluded to earlier, GXP regulated demands. So that's how we address that aspect of it. So that lets you audit the information, so you know exactly what's happened to it as you ingested that. So along with the ingestion and the metadata, so if we look at the consumption layer, so we start with knowledge management, that is really our data and analytics catalog. And that's where we also have interfaces that let data stewards and data managers essentially input or upload business metadata. So there's more context about that data set. And that's also the place where we enable a search interface. So you can discover, as a user, you can discover data sets. You can discover analyses that have been done on those data sets. And then the rest of the consumption layer, I'll speak through. So there's data sciences tools provisioned. So you've got your SaaS environment, which is a common platform for many data scientists in this field. There's a growing emergence of R and RStudio, along with Python and other languages that are essentially programming languages that they apply against the data. Then there's a set of applications provisions, such as the BI tools. And then we get into the expansion opportunity, which is the self-service analytics. And to Vikas's point, we have some accelerators there. We've got some modules that are off the shelf that address some of those, such as cohort definition and cohort insights. And then what we've done as well is develop custom applications on this stack for specific business purposes or high-value business questions that Merck business users have. And what we've actually done is we've stood up an agile application development factory to essentially be able to meet the growing demand of these use cases from the business. So once you open the floodgates, there's a lot of demand coming in. And then the last point I'll make on this slide is that the communication, so you see those series of arrows, the communication between the metadata and the data layer is done through a defined interface, an API, if you will. And that's very important because as the next request comes along, such as SageMaker or other tools, you can slot this in and plug it in with minimal effort, and it's designed to work that way. So extensible, modular, open, pluggable. And then what you'll also see on the far right is the personas of the users. So you've got the quantitative data scientists. Those are your programmers who are comfortable with programming their requests in their preferred language and then going directly against the Redshift data. And then you've got business insights consumers who are essentially looking at pre-built visualizations, pre-built analytics, so they can see the result of that and make their interpretation. And then there's this growing in-between, which are these citizen data scientists, where they're not programmers, but they want to have more control over how the analytics are done. And so that's an emerging user population within Merck and within the industry, in fact, that this platform is going to be catered to. If you can go to the next slide, Jeff. This is a more detailed componentized architecture of the RWDEX platform. And the only thing I'll mention here is within the Redshift database, we maintain, you can say, three models. One is the raw data in the tabular structure that it arrived in. So we process it, ingest it, check it for quality issues, deposit it there. So that's the raw data, if you will. And then we make use of a couple of industry standard models. One is called OMOP, and that's used for your traditional electronic medical records and claims data. And another is called Research Trust, which is used for kind of the more in-depth medical data, as well as some of the emerging digital and other types of data. So this is very extensible. And the last point I'll make on this slide is we applied a hybrid agile methodology because we wanted to be very close to the business and be responsive to their needs. And really what that meant was, the result of that is in the past 12 months, we've had 9 releases of this platform, 3 major, and then the rest kind of smaller, minor releases. So that's how we kind of address the guiding principles the challenge that was put to us to implement this.
Yep. Thanks, Raveen. And so maybe it'd be helpful just to kind of point out, like, you know, where the converged health components are, right? Kind of where we're able to accelerate, you know, a couple of areas. So.
Yeah, I omitted that part. So within the data model structure, so the research trust data model for those emerging, more novel data types is a model that has been developed by Deloitte, and it's becoming quickly a standard that's applied in many deployments. And then also in the application layer, so the self-service apps, so where you see observational research apps. So about half of those, so really DeepMiner, being able to compare patient cohorts, being able to define patient cohorts, looking at incidence and prevalence. Those are off-the-shelf modules, productized modules from Converge Health, again, that are assembled in this infrastructure and in this platform to accelerate the client's time to value from the data.
Maybe what can add is, maybe you're wondering what's on the left, in the whole left column, right? Those acronyms doesn't make any sense to you. It's because those are Merck divisions. So CORE stands for Center for Observational Real-World Evidence. That's where I sit. So we do observational research to improve patient outcomes using real-world data. And GHH stands for Global Human Health. That's our commercial organization. MMD, that's our manufacturer. MRL, that's our research, Merck Research Laboratories. So why do they care about real-world exchange? It turns out real-world data is useful for all those divisions. Same data sets, such as electronic health record data, administrative claims data, patient-reported outcomes, are useful for multiple purposes. But the transparency is important because we want to reduce redundancy. You know, commercial purchase one data, we don't have to purchase the same data. And the same data can be serving multiple functions.
Thanks, John. And thanks, Raveen, for covering that. So, you know, platform's been live for, 9 months or so now. So, Vikas, how do you see this, how are you going to evolve this platform from here?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think from an evolution perspective, I mean, it's basically evolving the individual components of the platform, right? So as you look at the data layer, how do you make ingest through surfacing the data cheaper, faster, error-free, right? How do you leverage components that can integrate third-party data into it? Like what Raveen mentioned, like data exchange could be a really good future tool that could sort of help with that. But the idea is, how do you drive economy of scale on the data layer? And on the solutions layer on top that you see here, like the whole observational and research apps and the microservices. So microservices are default. You want to build microservices for all the data sets that you start to ingest in. But the research apps are the key component. So our goal there, and what we've started to do there, is really drive an app factory model, right? To be able to put teams of developers on top of those microservices can develop apps that can cater to the right business use cases. And John can attest to this. As we get into 2020, there's a lot of new use cases as we start to leverage the data. There are a lot of more use cases that are surfaced. And what you want to do is drive faster value to business. The third piece on the tools end, on the tools end that you see here, those are all the tools that are sort of available to different sets of users. What we want to do there is much more drive the analytics to the edge, right? Push the analytics to the users. And I think one of the things I was looking at Andy Jesse's presentation this morning, and he talked about SageMaker Studio. I mean, that's a perfect example that could sort of plug in there and sort of be available to the end users now when it's as it matures. But I think the idea there is to drive this three-pronged approach to sort of keep building on top of the platform.
Okay. Thanks, Vikas. So maybe we transition now to talking a little bit about some of the value that's been delivered from the platform. So we've been through, was it 9 releases, right, over about a year.
9 already?
Yeah, 9 already.
I lost count.
So fast.
So we have a lot of users on the platform now. I think it's over 400 users playing with the platform. So if you could talk about some of the kind of the value that's been delivered from a business perspective, I think that'd be nice.
Sure. You mean at the end, yeah, it's business value, right? So after Vikas and the IT team designed the architecture, Raveen's team develop all the agile tools, we need to solve business problems. And how real-world data is being used to solve business problems range from looking at the burden of disease, such as prevalence, incidence, that's at early research stage. And also look at how clinical trial can be designed better using real-world data. And even recruit patients faster, because real-world is a term relative to clinical trial setting, clinical trial research. But when you recruit patients for clinical trial research, you still have to recruit patients from the real world, from a real-world healthcare system based on real-world healthcare data. Do you have this type of patients? How often you see them? How many you see them, right? So even for our commercialization and the market access is obvious. We need to know what type of patients will benefit from what treatment, and can we identify the right patient at the right time for the right treatment, right? And from providers' point of view and payers' point of view, and even more importantly, patients, right? They are our customers. So for providers, they are willing to prescribe our medicines to the patients because our medicines work better for certain patients. Payer, same thing. We need to demonstrate cost effectiveness and comparative effectiveness. So they are willing to pay. And patients, they are willing to adhere to the medications because it works for them. Either less side effect or better efficacy in the real world. So, for instance, the new way to do value-based healthcare is focused on actual real-world evidence. It's focused on real-world patient outcomes, so that payers are willing to pay for different treatments, and particularly for novel treatment compared to standard of care. So those are the business use cases, I said, important to us. We're making a lot of progress in product utilization, in pathway comparison, and also we're making new progress in the early stage, such as synthetic control arm. This is very important for FDA submissions when you do, for instance, single arm trial design for rare disease.
So I know, so those are all great examples of like applications helping solve specific challenges. And I know there's the application, we call it the time on treatment application that we've developed, and that one had more broader applicability across different groups. So maybe you could kind of talk about kind of the problem, the problem behind the time on treatment app and kind of what we did and what it solved.
Sure. So the concept of time on treatment is very simple, right? How long patients in real world stay on a certain treatment? It sounds very simple question, but it turned out very difficult to answer because the real world data come in many different forms. If it's an oral medication, you may need to look for such data in the table in terms of the pharmacy claims, let's say. If it's injectables, you need to look for medical claims. And not only that, you need to know how your product is being used in real world. You need to know which lines of therapy is being prescribed. For any disease, especially chronic disease, there's a first line, second line, and third line therapy. But the data doesn't tell you which line therapy it was described. So you have to map out from massive real world data the lines of therapy. For oncology, first line is chemo, second line is immuno-oncology product, or third line is a combination. You need to map it out. The data doesn't tell you. So that requires data analytics. And last, the methodology can vary a lot.
Yeah, and that
takes time.
Yeah, that's a very manual process.
It's a manual process, yes. It takes time, right? It's not efficient. And even statistically, it takes a lot of different variations. For instance, in certain markets, they will just average out all the patients' time on certain treatment. And from our center, we do more sophisticated methodology. We use time to event, Kaplan-Meier curve. So this particular use case help us is, number one, to increase efficiency, to reduce time to insight. So we develop an app, reduce time from months actually only to a couple of weeks from real world data to that insight. And how that insight is useful, for instance, our forecasting team will look at how long patients stay on our treatment in real world so that they can do better forecast, better for business, for marketing, for supply chain, for manufacture, so on and so forth. So that's efficiency gain. That's real-time insight. But also to us, in terms of patient outcomes, it's also beneficial because we standardize methodology. We'll make sure the evidence is scientifically sound. So we'll make sure all markets in different countries follow the standard methodology. So they don't use, something too simple, come up with misleading information.
Thanks, John. So great examples of business value. So Vikas, maybe you could talk a little bit about value from like an IT perspective that you've seen.
Yeah, and it's a interesting question because the way I see the value IT drives is really the business outcome that it drives, helps drive at a faster and at a scale that's significantly better, co-creating value with business. So the discussions that we are having, John and I and our teams have, are really co-creating value for the business, right? And I think that's a whole different equation from where we were before, right? Some of the other values that this approach really enabled was the agile development. Like as you start to componentize architecture, you can drive different teams and scale. You can increase the scale of building apps. So it really drove the agile at scale when you start to, and in order to sort of drive towards an agile and digital world, these type of architectures are really important because they really enable that, right? The third piece I would say is it gives you a lot more transparency in terms of cost, right? It gives you transparency in terms of the TCO, right? I could argue it would reduce the TCO in the longer run because you know what apps you want, you know you have a sustained data platform, you know when to sort of archive the data on the apps end, you know when to build apps, when to retire apps, and it really helped drive the ecosystem value, like overall TCO down.
Yeah, great.
So that's
great. Thanks, Vikas. Okay, so I know we're, I said it before, the platform's been live for about a year now. So John, what does the future hold? Like, what do you think are the top, in your mind, top 2 or 3 things you want to enable, in the coming months?
Yeah, I heard about this AWS data exchange. I think it's very interesting. Actually, in that session, I asked this question: where are the big players? Why didn't see big data vendors on your list? I saw some small companies, I saw some research institutions, right? That's great. They like to share data on AWS data exchange. But I think in the future, it may be the healthcare data ecosystem will change. It's not just a big data vendor who sell us data. Electronic health record, insurance claims, we know those large-scale data, very useful. But in the future, it's a patient-reported data. Actually, patient-reported health data and non-health data. So patient as a data owner may contribute more data to the ecosystem. So we saw an example in that session that a company that collect patient-reported data, I think it's called MedSafe or something, right?
Yeah.
So those new players will come in and contribute to this data ecosystem. I think that's one way we see larger data exchange happen, not just inside one company, but across the healthcare stakeholders. That's one, I think, emerging trend I look forward to. And second is this citizen data scientist role I mentioned. It's great that data scientists can do a lot of things, but we need to enable citizen data scientists so they can make data-driven decisions in their day-to-day business, so they don't have to wait for us to analyze complex data and give them answers in months or even sometimes in years, right? So that's, I think, a big game changer in the future or in any industry. And I'm glad that the life science industry is finally catching up.
Yeah. And so on the citizen data scientist role, so it's, it's empowering more stakeholders within your organization to generate insights themselves. So that's what, through the self-service analytic tools, or right? They may be able to write the underlying computer code, but for whatever reason they just don't want to, or they just don't have the time to do it. So it's through the self-service analytic tools.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, John. And so, from a platform perspective, Vikas, we've been talking a lot about real-world data and the different groups within Merck that are using real-world data to enable these use cases. Are any parts of this platform extensible to other areas?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, right? So the whole idea of driving a data platform and a solutions layer on top in terms of a componentized architecture is very important. You can reuse a lot of it, promotes a lot of reuse of code. It could be reuse of code, it could be reuse of design patterns, it could be, because Merck real-world data exchange is one of the data platforms. There are significant other data platforms across it. And the idea is how do you drive commonality and improve reuse? So I think that to me is the primary use of it, and a very important one, that it helps drive cost down. At the same time, it drives a lot of reuse of the component. So you remove the point of failures or reduce the point of failures. The other piece I think is the piece I talked about, driving agility in the organization, to be able to sort of provide an environment where you can create more value and scale up things in a faster way. So the model itself can be replicated in several other areas.
Oh, great. And Raveen, I know you've been obviously involved with this program, but similar programs at other clients. Where else have you seen platforms like this go from here?
Yeah, and keying off what Vikas said, the solution pattern can be applied to many problems in pharma and even beyond pharma for that matter. And really the next places are where we see a lot of interest and a lot of adoption of this approach has really been in the clinical space, both clinical operations, clinical data management, and clinical analysis. In the research side, in translational research and precision and personalized medicine. And then also moving towards the end of the value chain in commercial analytics. So this notion of a data platform that provisions the data through a controlled, managed process with specific applications, domain-specific applications, working off of that through an API to enable openness and extensibility is something that I think we're seeing a next wave of interest in. So there's a lot of interest in this.
That's great.
And I'll just add to what Raveen said. I think the key part here is you have, as I said, there are multiple different areas. So you also have research, a very interesting area, and research. From a research perspective, driving a research data aggregation is a far more complex problem than a real-world data aggregation. I think the difference in both of them.
I agree with that. Okay.
No, but I think the difference between all these ecosystems is the data itself, right? And the variety of the data, the volume of the data, the complexity of the data. And I think the patterns can be leveraged. You don't want to have one platform to solve every problem, but I think the pattern and reuse of the patterns are really important.
Great. Thank you. All right, so one final question, then we might have some time for some questions from the audience. I'll ask each of you guys. What do you think was the biggest key to success to date for the platform, holistically? So John, I'll start with you.
I think from organization point of view, it's important to have both top-down and bottom-up approaches. Meaning, it's not just decision. The top executives say, "Okay, we need a new platform." It's really the data scientist, the citizen data scientist, are part of this from the very beginning, so that they design the new apps, they design the new way of working, a new workflow, and they really benefit from it. I think that's the key to me. But of course, there are many technology involved and the agile approach involved.
Yeah. Thanks, John. What about you, Vikas?
So I would say two things. One is change management, second is collaboration. I think those were extremely key in order to get this sort of platform live. I think ultimately a platform can be as successful as the adoption and the user's ability to be able to leverage the platform, right? So those are the two things I think extremely key.
What really stands out for me is how collaborative we had to be with all of the various Merck teams. And there were a multitude. There were the business, there was IT, there was core, there was the release management organization, and there was the support organization. So really being the glue to essentially communicate between all those groups to get them on the same page. I think that's what really made this project special in my mind. And the desire to solve this problem as well was there. So that's what I recall.
Great. All right. Well, thank you guys. I thought it was a good conversation. We got about 15 minutes left. I know there's no microphones, but if there are questions, we're happy to answer some.
That EMR Spark framework that you're using for data ingestion, how did you find your teams being able to design custom ingestion of data as different feeds from different vendors? You get different data normalization capacity to get that data in. How was that framework to work with in order to actually develop each one of those different variations of data ingestion?
Sure. You want me to take that? Yeah. So, this wasn't the first time we've We've developed this ingestion framework. So we brought in a lot of knowledge in terms of an accelerator. So a core framework was leverageable, if you will. And then it's a metadata-driven framework. So if you get a data dictionary from, say, vendor A, you configure, you upload some of that information, you configure the checks for that, and then you apply that to the data stream. So in that sense, you configure the metadata layer of that, and then that allows the checking to be done against that data. Then you can apply additional checks, because a lot of vendors say that, okay, the data is very scattered, if you will, when they try and aggregate it. So here are a series of checks you should do to the data to ensure completeness and consistency, because those errors can creep in from month to month as they deliver that data, as well as things seem to just drop off, because this is purchased data, so it's not within your systems, within your control. So you may receive a batch of data and there's a domain missing. So having that dictionary to check against that, that's really what that metadata framework does. So it's metadata driven, if you will, that ingestion framework.
Well, I'll just add one thing to it. So I think, as John was mentioning, the data exchange. So I think something like a data exchange can help solve that particular piece at a much faster rate. And one of the things I mentioned is like that whole pipe of data. That's where, as Raveen said, I mean, those are the steps that it has to go through, right? And it is an error-prone process, because not every file that comes in is pristine. And I think tons of data vendors, and I think something like a data exchange can help automate a lot of that.
Yeah, just to add to that, the time for ingesting data sometimes can look very long, but it takes even longer time to identify the right data and to do the procurement, contracting before you ingest the data.
Yeah.
I think that timeline is even longer. So how we can reduce that time is critical to the business as well. Yeah.
First of all, a very impressive system that's been put together in 1 year. My question is about third-party data, or even just different sources of data. At what levels do you maintain data lineage, data provenance through that entire process? And what drives your decisions regarding data lineage and provenance?
That's a great question. I think there are both internal and external needs. I'd maybe start with external needs. Real-world evidence generation using real-world data is relatively new space, right? Comparing to clinical trial research to generate clinical trial evidence. And for the latter, FDA requires GCP validation. Basically, every step needs to be reproducible. For instance, we submit something to FDA, basically it's what should be look like. FDA press this button, everything is reproduced. It hasn't come down to this stringency yet for real-world evidence, but it's coming. And especially for us internally, to increase this credibility of real-world evidence, we need to show that transparency. We need to show that reproducibility before we say, oh, it's valid.
When you say it's coming, who or what is driving that process? Is it regulatory? And is it international regulatory as well as
Both.
jurisdictions?
Both. I think it's both the regulators and also the broad stakeholders of healthcare systems. We mentioned the payers, we mentioned the policymakers, we mentioned the healthcare providers and the patients. They all require real-world evidence in addition to clinical trial research evidence. And they all start to question how reproducible the results are, the evidence are, and how credible they are. And so that we have to show, at least start with our internal system, like you said, the lineage is there from end to end.
Yeah. And just to add to that, I mean, the FDA over the last several years has put out a lot of positions kind of encouraging the use of real-world data and evidence for regulatory submissions, whether it's getting label expansions or substituting control arms in trials. And that is, for label expansions and drug approvals, that's the highest bar of evidence. So being able to ensure that lineage is intact is going to be critical.
Yeah, even for clinical trial evidence, it takes decades to get there. It's not overnight. We all know that, right? What is the GCP validation, for instance? And also, they have clinicaltrials.gov to pre-register clinical trial protocols to increase that transparency.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm kind of curious, coming back to the question of how you create consent, sort of like bottom up and top down. I'm sure there was some resistance on both sides. So someone's kind of coming from the right side and wanting us to push in this direction. I'm curious how that was managed, like internal resistance and
So internal resistance within.
also, that's working with training part for people who are
Yeah.
not used to the current system. So like how to get that part in place. And second of all, the link to like, I don't know, it's more about the decision-making process because it drive, convince the key stakeholders or holdouts.
So I think one of the things I think that's critical is embed the key stakeholders in the process, right? So you don't design something outside of the process and give it to someone. So when someone's part of designing the process, they tend to sort of own it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's an essential part of change management that you have to drive. And I think change management at scale, right? The other thing I would say is a good product will automatically get a lot of users, right? If a product's not that great, what happens is there is a lot of resistance that you build up. But I think those two are the key principles in my mind. One is like embed the users to be part of the problem solving, right? And secondly, I think put a product that's sort of very important from a feature perspective that people can use. So it's like, so we had to make sure that a particular element of SaaS usage on the raw data was available and better than what the experience was currently in the older systems, right? So that's just one example, but that whole piece was part of the overall change management strategy.
Yeah, and just to build on that, so taking what Vikas said, getting those bottom-up people involved in the development of the solution and being very agile in refining it, right? So getting it perfect or exceeding expectations, because now you've created a change agent for the organization, and we created a change agent network at Merck that is essentially users of the platform that are, like head over shoulders, like happy with how it's performing, and they're your best, right? They don't need to hear it from us or from leadership. They want to hear it from their colleagues that this is the platform you want to be using.
Yep.
So kind of a two-part question, but when you're building something out like this for such a large organization, how are you making sure, and you're looking to expand it, right, beyond just this specific real-world data piece of it, how are you ensuring that you're really measuring the outcome of this, right? So the idea is to drive a lot of insight, but you can have a ton of insight. One, how much of it is actually meaningful, and how are you capturing that and measuring it so that way you can continually show that value and invest it back in to then continually iterate and build?
Yeah, that's a great question. You want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, it's a great question, but it's also itself is $1 million question. So how do we measure success, right? How do we come up with the right key performance indicators? How do we demonstrate the value, demonstrate the return of investment? So there are, I'd say, multiple waves of effort here. So, so we start with the number of users. So the old platform, we have about maybe 200 users, but the new platform already more than doubled it. So that tells us we are democratizing the usage of real-world data. And of course, we look across the user population. We see multiple divisions, as shown in the previous slide. It's not just our division. anymore. Okay? So that demonstrates that. Second is those what we call little subjective, transformative use cases. Transformative use case meaning, we're doing things that has not been done before. We're answering questions, we don't know how to answer before. At least we're not using real world data to answer it. For instance, we are working with clinical, one example, as I said, is to help with single arm trial, to come up with synthetic control arm using real world data. That's actually a new trend in the industry, in the pharma industry. That's just one example. And I think it comes down to the return of investment. I think that's most challenging question. How do you demonstrate that return of investment, and how do you translate to dollar in terms of, for instance, those transformative use cases? I think that's still being developed, and we're still in this journey to learn how to demonstrate return of investment.
Yeah. Yeah,
maybe you guys have a better insight from other companies.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I'd add is that there's a lot of analytics that go on about the users, right? What data sets they're accessing, what analytics they're doing. So we're tracking, being able to see that, 500 people have accessed these 2 data sources more than any of the other data sources, right? So we're getting more value out of these, but no one's accessed these 5. So now we may be able to sunset and cancel these subscriptions. So there's a cost savings aspect of it. There's efficiency gains in sharing code. So one key part of the platform is a validated code repository. So we're instilling and encouraging the sharing of code. So there's like efficiency gains happening where someone may be about to embark on a study, but now they have the ability to go see if someone's already done the exact same study on a different part of the organization, or maybe a similar study that I could build upon, and I could start to reuse some of that code. So we're getting efficiencies from a lot of the users. So, and then I think the third part is, data scientists in general get a lot of routine requests, and we're able to automate them in applications, so free up some of their time from those kind of mundane activities for some of the more high-value analyses. So we're putting their time and effort to better use. So those are some of the other areas.
Yeah, and I would add almost a fun tidbit. There's a little aspect of gamification as well. So we perform analytics on the usage of the platform, as Jeff said. So when you log in on the landing page, there's a ticker that says this many hours of computation done, this many users using it, this many data sets shared, this many cohorts shared. So you kind of get that effervescent bubble of like, this is an awesome place to be, and I want to bring my analysis and my use cases to this platform.
So right now, all the data sets are de-identified as they come into the platform. There are models. If de-identification is needed, there are services and applications that we have that can do that. But we're not there yet with Redux.
I think in terms of governance, we know that there's certain risk when you pull data from multiple sources and you try to link them. There's a certain risk of re-identification. I think governance is very important here. We make sure we're doing the right thing, and also we have validated research question behind it. So we're not just doing data linking for the sake of data linking. So, but starting with the data, as Jeff said, it's already de-identified. It's already HIPAA compliant data sets. Yeah.
Kind of building on that a bit, obviously, like there's multiple sessions and there's kind of tension echo between the democratizing side of the data and then governance and top line. You kind of touched on that a bit. And it's simply that because by having such a system, you can kind of do touching the data that kind of will
Well, that's one part of it, right? But then there's also technical controls where, I as a user want to use this data set for analysis. I click a button and it kicks off a governance workflow where I have to kind of populate some stuff, what I'm going to do with the data. It gets routed for the right approvals. So, access gets granted to the user for a specific period of time. We could then track what's being done with the data, and then we could shut off access when the study's done. So there's technical controls, there's policies as well, and then there's being able to track what's happening.
Is that going to administrator, or is that still automated?
No, right now it goes through administrators. So someone, like there'll be a data steward, right, who's very knowledgeable about what the data can and can't be used for, that it gets routed to.
Yeah, in addition to that, we also have more distributed approval system. So we don't solely rely on data storage, but also managers. Yeah. So for instance, for data analysis, the managers will approve for data scientists to do the analysis, so that don't fall on one person's shoulder. Yeah.
There's a whole workflow there, right?
Yeah.
Goes through it. Yep.
All right. So I think we're at time. Is there another one? One more?
How do you make sure that Amazon AWS is the right solution for this criteria?
I'm sorry?
How do you come to the conclusion that AWS is the right tool for this?
So as I said, I think when we started to look at the solution landscape, this was a year back, last October timeframe, right? And I think we looked through several different options, and I think we looked at it from a data as a platform perspective, and then the solution landscape, and I think we compared with a lot of other vendors in the space. And I think for these use cases, I think we thought it provides the right level of independence for us to componentize the data platform itself, right? And I think I feel really glad that we did it. Especially also with because there are tools that are much more integrated already, right? But here you can sort of bring things together and more plug and play with each other. I think it really provides a lot more flexibility from a solution build perspective. So there was a lot of analysis done there. What was that?
Your evaluation process.
That was about a couple months. Overall for the whole solution, it was a couple month long process. We had a team of 8 to 10 people working through different options and details of technology. Yep.
All right.
All right.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.